Get started. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm excited to talk today about public notice. So let me start with this this email. So this isn't actually I should say this is from an email that was sent this summer to an executive director of one of the state press associations. And I apologize one more time. Okay, so I just muted all of you, just so you know. We do that just because sometimes you get feedback, and it's better. We'll, like as Mary Louise said, we'll open it up at the end. If you have questions, you can do it then as well. In any case, so this email was sent earlier this summer to an executive director of one of the state press associations, and it was a message from the governor's chief of staff. I guess you've had time to look at it at this point. And basically, the chief of staff was writing to that executive director saying, look, a bunch of our state agencies are reporting to me that they've submitted public notices to newspapers that weren't run. And so he's just asking for some help, making sure that the papers in that state are running their notices. So I put it up here because it's obviously a real problem. If you've got the governor's office complaining about public notices that didn't get published. In this particular case, the problem was isolated to just a few newspapers, but the actions of those newspapers are imperiling public notice for everybody in the state. Now, the reality is most newspapers don't have this problem, right? Most newspapers run the notices they receive. But even the best papers sometimes take public notice for granted. And in some ways, it's understandable, right? They've been running in our newspapers for literally hundreds of years. Way back in 1789, the acts of the first session of the U.S. Congress required the Secretary of State to publish all bills, orders, resolutions, and congressional votes in at least 3 publicly available newspapers. So they've been running even before that, before the 1789 in the colonies. And so we tend to forget about them, but when you really think about it, they're kind of amazing. The federal and state governments actually pass laws requiring themselves to disclose information about their activities. They represent the best of self-government. We talk about the 3-legged stool. So along with open meeting laws and FOIA laws, public notices is an important part of that 3-legged stool of government transparency. And unfortunately, we're in danger of losing them. We're only going to prevent that if we stop taking them for granted. So that's what this webinar is about. It's about how each of us in the newspaper business can take a fresh look at public notice so we can maintain our historical franchise. Now, I'm going to start today by taking a minute to talk about the Public Notice Resource Center, the organization I represent. Then we'll talk about the general state of public notice around the country, and we'll conclude by talking about what all of us can do to help maintain the legal structure that mandates that public notices continue to be published in newspapers. So PNRC is a 501c3 charitable organization. It was founded in 2003 by the American Court and Commercial Newspapers, which is a trade organization for legal and courthouse newspapers like Nevada Legal News in your state. We're also supported by the state press associations, or I should say most of the state press associations from around the country, including NPA, and from some newspapers and newspaper companies as well around the country. We're not a lobbying group. I like to think of us as kind of a think tank. We provide research, education, and advice in support of newspaper notice, and we're really the only national organization focused on public notice. So when PNRC was founded back in 2003, the first thing that the organization did was conduct research about why the public notice laws were originally created. And we discovered they were built on 4 key elements. First, they need to be accessible. So everyone in the jurisdiction that's affected by the notice must have an opportunity to read the notice. They need to be published by an organization that's independent of the government agency or the corporation whose activities are the purpose of the notice. So this is the we can't have foxes guarding the hen houses element of public notice. There needs to be a way to verify that they were actually published in accordance with the law. That's key. And another element that goes way back from the beginning of public notices, they should be archived for the use of the judicial system, for researchers and historians and so forth. So each of these elements are critical aspects of the checks and balances that public notice was designed to foster, and we'll touch on each of them throughout our talk today. So as an industry, we're on the defensive. Laws that would move all or most public notice from newspapers to government websites were introduced in 18 different states this year. That's the most we've ever seen. There were 4 other states where they would have moved all public notice to, instead of government websites, to, they would have had competition for newspapers. You guys obviously were one of those states. You had to deal with a bill that would have allowed the notices to be placed on broadcaster websites, and I think it was also the Broadcaster Association website. So you actually had a really busy year in Nevada, but it was a good year. There were 5 different bills, or let me put it this way, that we were tracking, 5 bills that we were tracking that were introduced in Nevada that would have added a category of a newspaper notice, and there were 4 others that would have eliminated a category of notice, or in the case of the broadcaster bill, Aaron Ford's bill, obviously it would have affected all notice in the state. 2 bills passed in each of those categories. So 2 bills were added that, that in limited circumstances added newspaper notice, and there were 2 bills that passed that eliminated notice. There are minor bills, again, unusual circumstances, a name change under gender identity issue. I think that actually got some publicity, so you probably know about that. There was another one, but the key is both of those bills that did pass weren't opposed by the NPA. So you guys had a good year. Kudos to Barry and his team at NPA for that, and to all of your members for pulling it out. Having said that, despite the good news, this year we still have lots of work to do. We've got work to do at that macro level that we just discussed, where the laws are passed that could eliminate our role in the public notice process. But we also have work to do at the micro level, at the operational level of each newspaper. So every paper that runs public notices must share in the industry's collective responsibility, and we're going to focus primarily on that micro level today. All right, so here's some of the arguments that our opponents use when they're focused on the public policy aspects of public notice. The internet is faster and more efficient than print. Web posting lasts for the duration of the notice period. You don't have to, keep running a notice in a newspaper every week. You just put it on a website and it stays up there. Internet, at least theoretically, the internet offers broad availability, unlimited storage, right? Complete documents can be posted on the web. And here's the one we hear a lot. It's free to put notices on government websites. And when I hear them say free, I put quotes around it, because when I hear that, it just tells me that they aren't planning to spend money on design, presentation, marketing, or technology, the kind of things a newspaper does to make sure that we actually have readers. It also tells me that when they say it's free or it's cheap or whatever, they don't really care whether anyone actually reads the notices. Nevertheless, superficially, these are all good arguments. The key is the great majority of politicians who fight to take public notice out of newspapers aren't thinking about public policy. They have an ulterior motive. They're seeking revenge for tough reporting, or they're stoking anti-media resentment for political gain. And I'm going to go over a few examples, actually recent examples. Before I do that, let me mention one thing. Obviously, you guys had a different bill, a broadcaster bill, or a bill that would have opened it up to broadcasters. Different arguments. I am focused on government websites because it's throughout most of this, because I think that's ultimately where we see the biggest threat. It's where you see most of the effort taking place. So in any case, That's why I'm mostly focused on government websites. So those examples. So examples of politicians, public officials who tried to eliminate public notice from newspapers, but that really did not have public policy in mind. And here's a couple of governors. In the past 12 months, both New Jersey Governor Christie and Maine Governor LePage waged all-out wars in the newspapers in their states and used the public notice laws as a weapon. So they both loudly supported bills that would have moved all notice in their states to government websites. You'll understand, when you see the next couple slides, you'll understand why I used angry-looking photos to illustrate the governors. So this is what Chris Christie said, or one of the statements that Chris Christie made about public notice. He called the public notice laws in New Jersey corporate welfare, and he said they're shameful, antiquated, self-serving, money-making statutory scheme. LePage wasn't much better. Requiring legal notices to be printed in newspapers at a fee does nothing but prop up a dying, antiquated industry. The requirement is a taxpayer subsidy of the worst sort. So I got good news and bad news here. Good news is both of these bills were defeated in both New Jersey and Maine. The bad news is we're now in an era where governors wage high-profile battles against newspapers and weaponize the public notice laws. And I'm pretty sure that when we saw Christie and LePage step out on this issue this past year, it was the first time that we've actually seen a public notice battle elevated to the governor's office. So I showed you, so these are a couple guys who really, their efforts were ham-handed, I guess is the way I would put it. Here's an anti-newspaper politician who is more effective. Her name is Trudy Wade. She's a state senator from North Carolina who represents Guilford County. So Senator Wade really, really dislikes the Greensboro News and Record, which is the county's largest newspaper. For the last 5 or 6 years, she's been pushing legislation that would move public notice in North Carolina to government websites. This year, she finally had some success. In fact, just last month, the North Carolina legislature passed her bill to allow just her county, to allow Guilford County to publish all notices in the county on its official website and to charge fees for doing it. Now, I wanted to show you some of the things that Senator Wade did differently, because these are the things that when we see them should raise our antenna. These are, these are the kinds of opponents we hope not to see. So the first thing she did is she drafted a bill. It was a serious piece of legislation. I put, it's good in parentheses because I don't really think it was good. What I do think is it addressed issues like accessibility, verifiability, archiving, some of the things I talked about at the beginning. I mean, so her bill addressed those issues, and it was almost like she had been reading the materials on our website, the PNRC website. And so it's a little counterintuitive, but really the better the bills are that we face, the more we need to worry, because serious legislation helps to blunt some of our objections. So the second thing she did is, unlike Christie and LePage, Senator Wade's rhetoric wasn't overheated. She was coy about her true motives. It was clear to anyone, if you scratch the surface and you really knew what was going on, that she was seeking revenge against the Greensboro News and Record for its coverage, but she kept it hidden in public. Third, she was highly motivated and persistent. Like I told you, she kept at it for 5 or 6 years, didn't give up. Early this summer, her public notice bill, she had the public notice bill that she introduced in this session in North Carolina actually passed. It was a bill that was a statewide bill that would have eliminated, would have moved notice in North Carolina to government websites, but it was vetoed by the governor. And so at that point, we thought, we're safe. The governor vetoed it. They couldn't override the veto. But Senator Wade did not stop. She just came back and wrote another bill, a local public notice bill, again, that only applied to Guilford County. And it turns out in North Carolina, I think North Carolina is the only state where the governor cannot veto a bill that just affects one or two counties. So she passed it and got it passed. She kept at it, and she got it passed. She was politically savvy. She had some experience and juice in the legislature. These are the kind of factors that are going to make our job more difficult going forward. So this is from an editorial in New Jersey's second largest newspaper during the battle over the Christie bill. This is called the Record now. It used to be called the Bergen Record. Christie's bill would result in the closure of some small weeklies, hurt the bottom line of all newspapers, and ultimately cost 200 to 300 people their jobs. I put this up here to just make the argument that this is not an argument that we should be making. So remember that if you think back to the things that Governors Christie and LePage said, that they said that our current public notice laws are nothing but a taxpayer subsidy designed to prop up newspapers. This statement, I think, is just it's the corporate welfare argument in reverse. And this wasn't the only newspaper in New Jersey, by the way, that made this point. It was a central element of the argument that newspapers in the state were making during this battle. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are reasons that were unique to that particular situation that convinced papers in New Jersey to make that argument. And they won. It came close, but they won. So we're going to cut them some slack. Nevertheless, I mentioned it because I think we can all agree that we're on firmer rhetorical ground when we can argue that public notice belongs in newspapers because it works. Because it's still the most cost-effective way to notify citizens about city council meetings and agency hearings and tax proposals and foreclosures and all the other government and corporate activities that require official notice. And that argument starts with readership, print readership. Circulation is down, but plenty of people still pick up your paper and read it, or you wouldn't be in business. And if they weren't reading, politicians like Christie and LePage and this guy wouldn't be complaining so much about our coverage. So here's a great example of the continuing effectiveness of newspaper notice. I'm going back to North Carolina for this one. Like many other states, counties in North Carolina are required to run a notice in a local newspaper before they exercise liens on property for overdue taxes. So back in March of this year, Moore County, North Carolina, ran a 12-page notice in its local newspaper, The Pilot. That 12-page notice cost $8,000. And in return for that $8,000 investment, the county ended up collecting over 60% of its outstanding property taxes in the month after the notice was published. So they were owed $1.37 million. They collected north of $800,000 in less than a month after this notice was published. And as you can see, The Pilot wrote a story about the impact after the notice ran. And here's what Moore County's tax administrator told The Pilot in this story. This is a guy who's responsible for collecting his taxes. The newspaper still turns out to be an effective mechanism. People look for other people's names in the paper. It's just one part of the process for collecting overdue property taxes. So I'm going to go back to this slide because you can see I use thepilot.com. So I use their website to illustrate this slide only because I didn't have access to the newspaper. But make no mistake about it, in this case, it was mostly the newspaper, not the website, that produced this result. I also wanted to back up here and show you this because I wanted to encourage you that when you run a public notice that has an impact like this, I wanted to encourage you to consider running a story about it just like The Pilot did. Not only does this kind of story focus attention on the power of your newspaper to produce results for public notice, it also helps readers understand a government process that most citizens are only vaguely aware of. So for a second, that's about print, right? And about the continuing impact of print notice. And so for a second, let's forget about print notice and just focus, for the sake of argument, just on digital. Most bills, like I said before, seeking to eliminate newspaper notice look to government websites as the alternative. But the reality is that newspaper websites almost always generate considerably more traffic than government websites. And I took a look at a few examples in Nebraska. I used this website, it's called similarweb.com, to compare the newspaper to the official website or the cities and counties where they are located. I have to say I don't trust SimilarWeb's numbers. It certainly isn't as accurate as your internal web traffic measurement tools, but it's for our purposes here, it's good enough. So let's look at Las Vegas Review-Journal. I compared it to the Clark County website, official website. The Review-Journal gets about 6 or 7 times as much monthly traffic as Clark County. The Nevada Appeal gets more than 8 times the traffic of the Carson City website. And here is Elko, the Daily Free Press in Elko County. You know, the SimilarWeb didn't even have, for whatever reason, didn't have traffic data for Elko County, but you can see from the country rank that it's clear that the Free Press dwarfs the traffic of the Elko County website, whatever that traffic is. And I go through this because it's a powerful argument in favor of not moving public notices to government websites. Right? Keep them in newspapers, and for no additional cost, you're going to get both the print version of the newspaper and the website, which has a much larger readership than the government's website. So when we make that argument, it essentially makes it impossible for public officials to argue that moving public notices to government websites increases transparency. So it's a great argument to be able to make. And before I go on, let me add a clarification here to make sure you understand what I'm saying. Even when we make this argument, we're not arguing that public notice should be moved to newspaper websites. The print newspaper is still the best way to get notice out. We're simply arguing that government transparency would be crippled by moving notices from newspapers and their websites to government websites alone. We're all for the government's providing notice via their websites, but as a supplement, not an alternative to newspaper notice. Here's another factor that makes government websites unappealing as the exclusive source of public notice. They're primarily used for transactions. This was done by Pew Research, the study back in 2014. And you look here, and basically what you see is mostly it's used, to renew licenses, to pay a fine, apply for benefits, and so forth. The point is, nobody goes to government websites to read public notices, even when they're published there. So there's plenty of evidence to support that. And here's a couple of recent examples to illustrate the point. Both of these examples that I'm going to go through come from state environmental protection agencies. It's unfortunate, but the EPA and its state affiliates have been killing newspaper notice for the last 20 years, and on at least a couple of occasions has blown up in their face. And that's what, let me show you, let's talk about those recent examples. So this is in EPA terminology, this is what is known as a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a CAFO. This one's on the banks of the Buffalo National River in Arkansas. In December of 2012, citizens in Newton County, Arkansas were shocked when they learned that the state's Department of Environmental Quality actually approved a permit to operate this hog farm near their homes. They were shocked because the only way they could have learned about it, about the permit application, I should say, is to visit the agency's website, where notice about it had been published for 30 days. So it was on the Department of Environmental Quality agency website in Arkansas, seeking comments on the application, on the permit application to build the hog farm. They got 0 comments in 30 days. So this hog farm, in this case, actually got built despite several lawsuits. And 4.5 years later, this is still a huge controversy in Arkansas. Just Google Buffalo River hog farm, and you'll see recent news about this. It's the controversy isn't all about public notice. That was obviously part of that, but the point is people did not have an opportunity to raise objections because they didn't know about it because of the lack of real notice. Here's what the agency said, the head of the agency said about the notice that they posted on their website. So I understand the way people feel. They feel like this happened and nobody knew anything about it. So that was the head of the ADEQ. Here's another more recent example. This one's from Michigan. People in Michigan were surprised to learn, this was just last November, so it's about a year ago this whole thing started. The state's Environmental Protection Agency issued a draft approval. So in this case, it hadn't been approved yet. It was a draft approval of a proposal that would have allowed Nestle to pump more groundwater for its Ice Mountain bottling plant in Stanwood, Michigan. Notice of this proposal had been on the agency's, the environmental agency in Michigan on their website for 42 days, but nobody knew about it. So guess how people in Michigan eventually learned about the proposal? It's from a news story in the Grand Rapids Press. A reporter at the press heard about it and wrote a story that was published in the paper and on its website, and it was a huge story in Michigan that generated several follow-up stories and thousands of comments opposing the proposal from citizens throughout the state. So it was 42 days on the MDEQ website, 0 comments. Story in a newspaper about it, they received, I think it was 3,000 comments within the first month. The last I checked, I think the head of this agency said that she had received 35,000 emails in opposition to the proposal. And here's what she said, the head of that agency, after the citizens erupted. So the director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, here's what she said, admitting that 42 days on the agency website wasn't enough. So 42 days on an government website, it still wasn't enough. Nobody knew about it. So both of these examples, I think, illustrate an important issue about what I believe is an intrinsic difference between the print and online experience. The print version of a newspaper happens to be a communication medium that's really well suited to be a source of public notice, and that's the result of serendipity, right? So when we read a newspaper, you know, the size of the page and the tactile experience of holding the paper, looking around the page, that whole experience leads us to find things we didn't expect to see. So what that means is it guarantees that public notices in local newspapers are going to be seen by many people in a community who didn't necessarily pick up the paper intending to read them. We behave differently on websites. We tend to be goal-oriented when we're online, and so we go to a website looking for particular information, and we're unlikely to find information that we're not specifically looking for. So public notices on a website get lost, and they're easily hidden. It's not impossible to build some level of serendipity into a website. You know, we pay designers to do that, but it's far more difficult than it is to do with a newspaper. And there are plenty of other reasons why newspapers are still the best delivery system for public notice. They don't go down or get hacked like websites. Plenty of studies show that the average newspaper reader is more civically engaged than the average citizen, more likely to act on a public notice or care about a public notice or read a public notice. The digital divide isn't closed yet. I mean, this is obviously an acute issue still in rural areas. You know, I've been talking all about websites, and the reality is that these days people are really looking when they're online. They're doing it from smartphone. David, to prove in a court of law that a public notice actually ran. So a contrast with a website notice, you'd still need to have someone come into court and actually testify that it actually ran. So all those, we got lots of good reasons and lots of things in our favor, but we still got a lot of work to do. And you know, we need to get much better collectively at public notice if we're going to maintain the franchise. And generally speaking, that's, as I mentioned before, it's a problem of taking public notice for granted and not treating it with the same care and respect as our other categories of advertising. So remember, our circulation is declining. That means we need to do more to maintain the same level of effectiveness that we provided in the pre-internet era. And now let's talk about some of the ways that we can do that. First, and maybe the most important one, is they need to be readable, right? Too many public notices in newspapers are too ways to be more creative in how we present them, and making sure that people actually have an opportunity to see them in the back of the paper. And that's mostly about design. So here are a bunch of design ideas that the consultant Ed Henninger shared at a best practices conference we held last year. I think it was last September, in conjunction with the National Newspaper Association annual convention. Some of these may work for you, others may not. So I didn't put them up here because I think everybody needs to do all these things. They're up here because it's important for us to start thinking about how to use design elements to draw attention to public notice, in the same way that we think about drawing attention to the stories and the advertisements that we publish. Here's a good example of someone who went whole hog, I guess I'd put it. This is a paper in Kentucky that within the last year or so redesigned its public notice page. The guy who's the owner of this paper is a former reporter, and as a reporter, he used public notice in his reporting. And so he understood that public notice has news value. So he decided to make his public notice pages look more like his news pages, and this is the result. So in Kentucky, it's the requirement is 7-point type. He made his 10-point type. The headlines are 30 and 35 point, and he left plenty of white space, as you can see, between the notices. Now, whenever I made this presentation at a newspaper conference, in other words, in front of a live audience, I notice one thing happens whenever I put this slide up. I notice that some of the publishers in the audience roll their eyes when they see this one. And I get it. You have more things to worry about than just public notice. You got challenges coming at you from every angle these days in the newspaper business. So maybe it doesn't make sense for your company or your market to do something like this, but the larger point remains: circulation is down, so we need to do something to drive more eyeballs to our notices. Excuse me. We talked about this one earlier: print and digital. All you need to know to realize how important this issue has become, in other words, that you need to be publishing the notices that are in your newspaper on your website as well. There are press associations in 12 different states help to enact laws in their states requiring newspaper notices to be published on the web. It's a defensive measure, so what I haven't heard about yet is any public notice police going and arresting people for not putting the notices on their site in those states. But they did it because legislators these days want to know that newspapers are publishing notices on their websites it's kind of a price for continuing to support newspaper notice. They understand what's going on with circulation. They understand that people are looking at the web and they expect to see them on the web. And so it's a way for the papers in those states that have this law to demonstrate that they're serious about driving eyeballs to the notices. So now I'm going to make your job even more difficult. In addition to posting the notices on your own site, you should post them on the NPA site as well. And I will say here that when I looked at a bunch of your newspapers. Everyone that I saw, every site that I looked at, you are publishing the notices on your website. So kudos for that. I don't know how successful NPA has been to getting everybody to publish the notices on the NPA site, but I think it's important that you do both. And so I wanted to mention that here. Now, I searched. I just put in my Google search bar, Nevada public notices, and I found the NPA site. But guess what else I found? This one makes me a little bit nervous. I found this one's hosted by the state of Nevada, so they have a Nevada public notice website. So here's why it makes me nervous. If I ran the state government and wanted to move public notice to government websites, I'd create a statewide site like this, and then I'd market the heck out of it. That, to me, is a more serious approach than what we see with most of the bills. Like I talked about the bills in New Jersey and Maine. In those cases, and in most cases, what we see are when they want to eliminate newspaper notice, they leave it up to local government websites, county websites, city websites, school district websites, and so forth to publish their own notices. So they spread the notice across, hundreds or thousands of different government websites, which would make the notices, difficult to market, difficult for people to find. So the fact that in Nevada they've already got one, as I say, it makes me a little nervous. It's kind of like, kind of the Trojan horse kind of idea. In any case, it is what it is. The other side of this, I guess, is that if you could use this. My guess is most of the government, a lot of notices aren't getting published on this site, and maybe you can use that as an argument. Whatever it is, they've already got this thing going. So, and I'm guessing that a lot of you already know about this. So let's go back. So you've now published notices on your website. You can't put them behind a paywall. It's a big no-no. Again, in my limited search, I didn't see any newspapers in Nevada that are doing this. So kudos for that. Now, once you've published the notices on your site, you need to make sure that people can find them. And the easiest way to do that is to provide a navigation link on your home page. This is the best example that I could find in Nevada. It's the Reno Gazette Journal, and you go to their home page, and it's, you see this public notice link here, because I am focused on this kind of thing. I'd love to see it way up on top. But you know what? This is great. I mean, this is fine. It's in all caps. So this is the right way to do it. Put a standalone link on your home page. Most newspaper websites and most of the ones I saw looking around in Nevada, they put the notices behind the classifieds link. And the problem with that is, you may know that your public notices are in the classifieds, but your readers don't know, don't know that, right? So if anyone actually was looking for it, they'd have a hard time finding it. Another thing I like about the way that the Review Journal, what the Review Journal did is they call them public notices. And for marketing purposes, we encourage you to call them public notices instead of legals or legal ads. Public notice sounds like a civic good. The words have a positive connotation. Legal ad sounds scary, like someone did something wrong and needs to be told about it. So it's really about, when we're making our arguments, it's about trying to appeal. Part of it is just appealing to people's emotions, and I think public notice just sounds better. I'm going to give a quick example to make this point that I hope makes this point. So here's a couple of ads. I think one of them may even be from Nevada. But anyway, it says, public notice on top. These are not public notices as we understand them. These are used car ads. But the words public notice are so powerful. They have the official imprimatur. They're so powerful that these auto dealers decided to use them to get people to pay attention to their used cars. It's impossible to imagine them doing the same thing with the words legal ad or legal notice or legals. So the words public notice are a gift, and I encourage you to use them exactly that way. Here's another thing, another quiver in our tools, is to report on the notices. So PNRC gives out an annual journalism award every year for stories that were originally based on public notice, and the stories that are on this list all won awards in our contest. And these were pretty big deal stories. Here, as you can see, Reporter and Farmer, as you can probably guess, is a small town newspaper. Embezzlement of $72,000, that was this year's winner. That's a big deal in a small community when a public official embezzles that amount of money. But there's no reason you can't report on some of the less scintillating notices that run in your paper. It's just an easy way to add value for both your readers and for your public notice advertisers. And I argue that people will read those stories. And here's a recent example. A couple of months ago, the Scranton, or what's it, 3 months now, I guess, or the end of in August, all right? So the Scranton Times-Tribune, a paper in Pennsylvania that really does notice really well, they published a story about a county tax sale, same kind of sale we saw earlier that took place in Moore County, North Carolina. In this case, the story that was published concurrently with the notice. So the same day the notice went up, they did this story. So it wasn't about the impact of the notice, it was more about the process the county goes through leading up to the publication of the notice and the property sale. And look what happened, right? It's the most read, hang on one second. Sorry about that. This thing is sensitive. It's the most read story that day. So, people want to read this, want to read about these kinds of things. This was from their website. I guarantee you that people, the impact may have been even bigger in the newspaper in terms of the number of people, what people focused on. So people will read these stories. Here's the key. If you're going to report on them, you got to make sure that someone is reading the notices in your paper. If you're not reading, if you're not the person reading, or if the publisher's not reading, or the editor, just make sure somebody on the staff is responsible for every day, if you're a daily, every week, if you're a weekly, make sure that someone is responsible for reading the notices and reporting up the chain. Train your employees. And this is, as we know, public notice laws are very specific about what the notices must say and when they need to run. And when your employees aren't trained to know that, it can cause major problems. It's an especially big issue. Poorly trained employees are especially big issue when the government personnel who are placing the notices don't know what they're doing either. Then you've got the blind leading the blind. That happens a lot. I mean, so I think more often than not, the government folks who are doing this don't know what they're doing. So we do a monthly newsletter on public notice. I think some of you signed up for it. You might even received the one that we sent out this month in November. One of the things you may have noticed, if you did receive it, in this month's issue, we wrote about or linked to 7 different stories about missing or erroneous notice. And in each of those cases, the government had to scramble because of the failed notice. Things like, postponing a vote on a bond issuance or rescheduling a meeting and so forth. I mean, it's a big deal when the notice is insufficient. And so, we can't do that. I think the other point I'll make here is, this is the kind of thing, if you've got employees who are trained well, it can be part of your value proposition, right? You can say to government agencies or the people who are putting the notices in your paper, we're not just going to accept anything you give us. We're going to make sure that what you're doing complies with the law. When you're able to say that, you're actually providing real customer value. So as I mentioned at the beginning, way back from the beginning of when public notice first came into existence in the U.S., the ability to archive has been an essential element, and it's an advantage that print is always going to have over digital. Problem is that newspaper archives are disappearing because in the digital age, and what's happened is that fewer publishers are maintaining bound volumes like this paper here, which it looks like they waited a little bit too long to make sure they were they were maintained properly. But in any case, fewer publishers are maintaining bound volumes. We've become too reliant on digital storage. And so what happens is programming languages change, platforms change, websites get redesigned, and the archives become unreadable. So how many lost public notices are there out there on floppy disk or CD-ROMs that no one can read anymore? So maintaining bound volumes is still the best option, but we realize, the horse has left the barn on that particular issue. So the second best option is, have a strong agreement with a third party, like a library or a local historical commission, to maintain your paper's print archive. And I know that lots of people have those kinds of third-party agreements, more often than not with a local library these days. But the key there is make sure you have an agreement and you understand what's in the agreement. And make sure it's a written agreement and you understand. So what you don't want is you don't want them, the organization you're working with, to be able to just dump your papers. Excuse me, someone's calling. You don't want them to dump the papers out back if storing them becomes an inconvenience, right? So we touched on this earlier. Public notices often need to be authenticated for use of evidence. And emails, PDF won't work in a court of law, so you'll need an affidavit with a notarized signature. The best practice is to provide affidavits as a matter of course. Some states actually require it by law, but even where it isn't a matter of law, providing a notarized affidavit is an excellent way to confirm for your public notice customers that the notice actually ran. It's another way to provide outstanding customer service. Prices should be reasonable. In Nevada, I think lots of states, they regulate public notice by law. But in Nevada, the law only says that you can't charge the government more than your quote advertised open display rate if your circulation is under 15,000, or the published rate for advertising by a nonprofit or charitable organization if your circulation is above 15,000. So I assume it's the price gouging isn't an issue in that situation. But I wanted to read to you real quickly an email I received last week from a publisher just to give you a sense of the dimensions of this particular issue. So this publisher wrote an email and said I'm at the United Trustee Association conference this week, it's an association that specifically deals with foreclosure. So this is about foreclosure, and he listed like 7 or 8 different states, including, by the way, Nevada, who deals with foreclosure notices in these states. And so here's what he said: there is a rumor afloat that many members are unhappy when he says members, customers of our customers, is what he says, they're unhappy with newspaper price gouging. So members of the United Trustee Association who place these ads are unhappy. They're looking at ways to deal with this. The immediate problem are small newspapers in monopoly markets. They are charging between $1,500 and $9,000 for the publication of these notices. These publishers don't realize that in the short term they are making good money, but in the long term they may be leading to the demise of public notice and its source of revenue for them. I don't know if this is an issue anywhere in Nevada. I just thought I would mention it because sometimes it can be, and I guess the only way to deal with it is, the associates. It's difficult for the association to deal with it, but publishers who do that need a talking to. So that's the best practices at your newspaper. I wanted to end with this crucial best practice that has nothing to do with your paper's operation, but it has a big impact on whether we're going to be able to retain public notice. Build a relationship with your state senators and representatives. And the key here is to build a relationship before you need anything from them. So before the bad piece of legislation has been introduced. All of us prefer to do things for people we know, and politicians are no different. So if you haven't done it already, now is a good time to start building that relationship with your state legislative representatives and their staffs. We're fighting an important battle here. This isn't just for our newspapers. It's also for the communities that expect us to serve as their eyes and ears. If we don't do the job we need to do to protect our franchise and the responsibility for providing public notices left to the government, everybody loses. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, PNRC accepts charitable contributions. So if you want to support the organization, the only organization that's focused on public notice at the national level, just go to our website, pnrc.net. We make it real easy for you to do that. It's the key is it's a charitable contribution, so it's a tax credit. So in any case, thanks for listening. I think I did go way over time. I apologize. I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm going to open the phones up. It looks like everybody's still with us here. And everybody who hasn't muted their own phone can now talk. So anyone out there has any questions about any of this stuff? I see caller 1, caller 2, caller 3.
I'll make a point, Richard.
Sure. Okay, Barry, go ahead.
Because you mentioned that Nevada state site of public notices, and what that is at the moment, anyway, was created for and does is simply meeting notices, and that's kind of leads to a point that a lot of people just don't even really understand what public notices are. But that site does exist, and governments are required to upload their notices of public meetings there.
So, do you guys monitor it, Barry? Like to see well, I mean, it'd be hard to monitor, but I mean, the kind of thing is, and I don't know if you haven't dealt with this issue at least last year with the government website where they're trying to move stuff to government websites. But to the extent that the governments aren't putting a notice on this site is a good indication of what they would probably do if the law ever changed, and that was the only source of notice. So that was the positive side.
There are a couple of other examples that I always encourage the newspapers to check, where the law was changed to require a reduced notice, say, of their quarterly expenditures and revenues, where once upon a time they were required to print these long lists of every bill that they ever paid for a month or for a quarter. And that notice was changed to that they still need to publish a summary of those expenses and revenues, and then post the actual list, every bill, on their own websites. They're very lax in doing that. So that's an argument for keeping an eye on them.
Yeah, so keep track of that and keep a list of when they don't do it, because when you have to hopefully you don't have to deal with it, but at some point someone's going to introduce the bill, to move it to government websites, and you can use that as an argument. I did notice one of the bills that was passed this year, it looked like to me, out of all the bills I've seen that passed, it added newspaper notice, and all across the country, and there were probably about 20 of them. They're always in narrow categories, but in Nevada, there's SB 10. I hope this didn't get amended before it passed, and I don't have egg on my face here, but it enhances annual abandoned property notice by requiring it to be published in newspapers in each county to state a size no less than the full page. So it looks like that maybe people were trying to, or the government was trying to get away with doing it smaller, and now they've required them to do it at least page.
The Tammy and the folks from the Review Journal worked very hard on it. That was a compromise where they wanted some more flexibility in how they were going to do that. So in some respects, it increased the notice. In some respects, it reduced it a bit, but it did change how they're doing that. So I think that was a pretty good example of how we can work on things.
Yeah, well, congratulations to Tammy and to you guys. So, anything else you want to add, Barry?
Nope, I think you covered it well, Rich. All
right. Well, with that, I don't hear any other questions. And obviously, if you want to email me, and you have my email address now. If you have any questions or anything, I'm happy to answer by email as well. And I wanted to thank everybody again for joining. I think I went way over time. I can't see what time it is here. I apologize. But I see that everyone stayed, so thank you. All right, bye, Mary Louise, and thanks for the opportunity to do this, Barry. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for doing it.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
see.